Welcome to episode 21. In this episode, we will discuss the Nephilim. When I tell people that I'm doing a podcast series going through Genesis chapters 1 through 11, the first thing they ask me a lot of times is, what do I think about the Nephilim? So in this episode, we will discuss that topic. First, let's read the verses in question. They are Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh. Yet his day shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, and the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The two questions that this discussion hinges upon is, first, what are the giants? And second, what are the sons of God? It is these terms that people try to interpret. The answers to these questions are kind of intertwined, so I will discuss the three main interpretations of these verses. These are the views that we find most commonly. They are the Sethite view, the human royalty view, and the fallen angel view. First, let's start with the Sethite view. The Sethite view claims that the sons of God were the godly descendants of Seth, Seth being the one whose lineage Jesus would come. This interpretation of the sons of God pulls from the basic logic that people who are associated with God are considered his sons, similar to how the Bible talks about Christians today. And then this view would see the giants as just some sort of human champion. Nothing supernatural going on here. This view says that these verses describe the godly descendants of Seth intermarrying with the daughters of sinful men, and these marriages slowly led the descendants of Seth away from God, resulting in more evil. This view is attributed to Augustine in the 4th century. Next, we have the human royalty view. This view is pretty similar to the Sethite view, except that it would say that the giants, instead of being just some generic, powerful man, actually are some kind of royalty or king. This view also came about later in Christianity. The main characteristic of these two views is that they largely avoid a supernatural explanation for the sons of God and giants. Proponents of these views sometimes express strong aversion to any sort of concept of the intertwining of fallen angels and humans. The third view that we will discuss is the fallen angel view. This view is definitely a lot more mystical, and in my opinion, more exciting. To me, the Sethite view and the human royalty view are actually kind of lame. They seem to come from more of a product of secularism than an understanding of the themes in the Bible. This doesn't mean that they're wrong per se. However, I think these views have a lot more unanswered questions than what the fallen angel view has. The prevailing secular liberalism of our culture has erased a lot of the perception of the supernatural that many other cultures around the world have, including the ancient Jewish culture of where the scriptures came out of. I would say this loss of respect and understanding of the supernatural is a bad thing, and the Sethite and the human royalty view run just a little bit too closely to a secular way of thinking. Secular simply means beliefs without spiritual basis. So now we can get into the fallen angel view. The fallen angel view sees the sons of God as angels and giants as the offspring of these angels and human females. Obviously, this behavior would be far removed from the will of God, so these angels are not ones who are righteous and holy, but instead, they would be those who followed the rebellion of Lucifer, and therefore would be trying to destroy God's creation and subvert his will. Sometimes people will say that it is impossible for angels to procreate with humans. However, I don't see any justification for this belief in the Bible. So if someone holds this belief, it's just their personal opinion, not something that's biblical. There is evidence throughout the Bible for angels appearing as physical beings, especially in the story of the heavenly messengers who came to visit Abraham and went to visit Lot in the city of Sodom. Also, after Jesus arose from the dead, he came back with a new physical body that had the scars from his earthly wounds and could consume food. This shows that the spiritual realm is not completely separated from all things physical. I see no reason to believe that angels can't take on a physical form. These unholy unions resulted in great wickedness, as described in verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So then we must ask ourselves, is there biblical justification for this view? I would say that there's no single verse that proves it 100%. However, there are multiple themes throughout the Old and New Testament that make a lot more sense if this view is the case and can be traced consistently throughout the whole story of the Bible. Also, I see no theme or concept or principle or verse that contradicts this belief. There are no verses that need to be twisted or reinterpreted in order to make this view seem true, unlike many other theologies or ideologies. So, let's explore these themes throughout the Bible. First, we will look at how the Bible speaks about the supernatural realm in ways that are largely absent to the secular worldview prevalent in the American culture. Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 through 12 read, "There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of the times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer, for all these things are an abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee." These verses are actually really interesting. Growing up as a kid, things like witches or wizards or necromancers only existed in storybooks and video games and movies. They simply belonged in myths and fantasies. However, if witches and wizards and necromancers are only figments of imagination, why then are they specifically called out in God's law? It wouldn't make any sense for God's law to ban some fantasy, so this means that these kind of characters are actually real. These aren't even approached as some vague concept. There is a great distinction for the different kinds of spiritual evil and sorcery that an individual can pursue. An enchanter or a charmer are not just some abstract concept, but two distinct paths of evil that somebody can fall into. Verse 12 is a very strong rebuke against these spiritual evils. A strong rebuke like this wouldn't make any sense if these things were just fantastical. Ultimately, what these different things are ways to pursue spiritual power outside of God. And yes, this is a very bad idea. And it makes perfect sense for God to warn against and drive these sinful behaviors away. Let's read a couple more verses. Isaiah 14:9 reads, "Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations." Proverbs 21:16 reads, "The man that wandereth out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead." These two verses point to some kind of spiritual underworld. A lot of times, the Hebrew word used for this underworld is Sheol. This spiritual underworld is referenced many times throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. In Hebrews, it's called Sheol. In Greek, it's called Hades. It is described as a dwelling place for spirits who are separated from God. Next, let's consider the phrase, sons of God. While sons of God can mean those associated with God, as in people who follow Him, and not exclusively angels, there are some verses that show that, within context, the phrase sons of God can be specifically referring to spiritual beings. This is most explicitly found in the book of Job. The verses where this can be found are Job 1:6, Job 2:1, and Job 38:7. Job 1:6 reads, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them." It is very clear here that the sons of God is referring to spiritual beings. Job 2:1 reads, "Again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord." Job 38:6-7 reads, "Where are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." God here is talking about the foundations of the earth during creation. Obviously, only spiritual beings could be present during the laying of the foundations of the earth. Also, let's take a look at some verses in Psalms. Psalm 29:1 reads, "Give unto the Lord, O ye mighty, give unto the Lord glory and strength." Psalm 89:6 reads, "For who in the heaven can be compared unto the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty can be likened unto the Lord?" I read these verses in the King James Version. However, other translations translate these phrases a little bit differently. The mighty or the sons of the mighty are also translated as heavenly beings or divine beings. Scholars believe that what these verses in Psalms are referring to as sons of the mighty or heavenly beings or divine beings are the exact same beings that would have been before the throne of God in the book of Job. So here we have a consistent theme of a group of spiritual beings around the throne of God that are explicitly referred to as the sons of God. There is another verse that many scholars attribute as a reference to the sons of God. It is Deuteronomy 32:8. The verse reads, "When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel." If you're wondering where the sons of God reference in this verse is, the answer is it's not in the King James Version. If you look in other English translations, some of them will say children of God instead of children of Israel, and these are two very different things. There are other translations that say children of Israel. However, what the scholarly thought around this verse is that when the King James translators were translating the Bible, the original text that they had for this verse was slightly damaged. They couldn't tell if it said Yisrael or simply just El, so they went with Israel. However, later research showed that the original text for this verse most likely says El, which means God, instead of Israel. And even if you just think about it, this verse is referring to the Tower of Babel, when the sons of Adam were separated. The sons of Israel weren't even on the scene at the Tower of Babel. So it would make a lot more sense for this verse to say children of God. What then does this mean? Well, the concept is that when the nations were scattered from the Tower of Babel, God set a spiritual being to rule over each of these nations. That's what it means when it says he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of God. And then it was the nation of Israel that God himself chose to rule over. God was the spiritual being ruling over Israel. Sadly, the spiritual beings of these nations led the people into rebellion, sometimes very dark rebellion, instead of leading them to God. Even the nation that God ruled over, now we would think that God is perfectly equipped to rule over a group of people. Instead of God leading the people astray, which isn't possible, the people simply just rebelled against God. Let's follow this theme of fallen angels into the New Testament. Jude 1:6 reads, "And the angels, which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." 2 Peter 2 verse 4 reads, "For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment." So in these verses, it does not specifically state that angels had children with daughters of men. However, more clearly seen in the verse in Jude, it refers to some kind of instance where angels stepped outside of their God-given responsibility. And, well, having children with humans would definitely be a step outside of their God-given responsibility. Also, another reference to angels can be found in 1 Corinthians 11:10. The verse reads, "For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels." Now, it is a bit mysterious as to what Paul was meaning here when he said because of the angels, but the reason I bring this up is because some scholars think that this verse is referring to the angels in Genesis 6. And the thinking behind this is because of the sin of angels, specifically their sin with human females, the women among God's people today need a special power to counter the spiritual evil of the past. The historic Christian interpretation and practice of this verse is for women to wear a physical covering. And this was consistently practiced for nearly 2,000 years. Now, the interpretations of this verse changed in the modern era, specifically after the sexual revolution and the feminist movements. But the sexual revolution and the feminist movement should not take away from historic Christian practice and tradition, and the culture transcending reasons that Paul gives for a physical covering. Paul references the divine order of Christ, man, and woman, which was established in Genesis 1. In verse 14, he appeals to nature itself, which was also established in Genesis 1. And also verse 10, which could possibly relate to Genesis 6. But if not, angels are still beings that transcend all cultures and have existed throughout time. The fact that the divine order and nature itself was established in Genesis 1 is a universal reality, regardless of the culture that you're in. While that was a bit of a rabbit trail, it was still directly tied to Genesis 1 through 11, so I think it was important to bring up. But now, getting back to Genesis 6. So these verses reflect awareness of a supernatural realm by the authors of the New Testament, which is quite different than the common worldview and the culture around us. So now, let's consider giants. First, and while the Sethite view wouldn't see the giant as something supernatural, it wouldn't make sense for the Old Testament authors to create such a distinction around this creature of giant if it were just some kind of normal human. The Hebrew word that's used for giant in Genesis 6 is Nephil. Nephilim is plural for Nephil. This comes from the root word of Naphil, which means to fall, which would make sense if they came from angels who fell. This word is only used one other time in the Old Testament, and that's from the spies who scouted out the land of Canaan and came back with an evil report. They said they saw giants, or these Nephilim, and the intention of this report was to scare the people away from entering the land of Canaan. What's interesting is that for all of the other references to giants in the Old Testament, a different Hebrew word is used. It is Rapha, or Rephaim. This word appears 21 times and is either translated as giant or it's transliterated as Raphaim. The scholarly thought is that Raphaim either have a strong connection or direct descent from the Nephilim, the original giants. An important thing to point out here is that there were giants before the flood and after the flood. Does this mean that the giants survived the flood? I would say no, because Peter clearly states that only 8 souls survived the flood. Now a question is, do the giants have souls? Is it possible for them to be saved? I would say yes, because the Bible treats them as real humans, albeit with a unique ancestry. But whether or not any of the giants ever chose to be saved is unknown. Typically, they're associated with great wickedness. If we look closely at Genesis 6, verse 4, the verse reads, "There were giants in the earth in those days and also after that." So when referring to the giants, it says they were in the days before the flood and also in the days after the flood. This could simply mean that after the flood, the angels sinned again and came back and had more children with human females. Let's read some of the verses in the Old Testament that talk about giants, or Rephaim. Genesis 14:5 reads, "And in the 14th year came Kedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shavath Kerathaim." So not only here do we have the Rephaims, but also the Zuzims and Emims. What in the world are the Zuzims or Emims? I do not know at the moment, so maybe later in life I'll figure it out. I have heard people say that perhaps like the Rephaim, they also descended from the Nephilim, but personally I haven't specifically looked into what the Zuzims or Emims actually are. Actually, Deuteronomy 2, verses 10 and 11 give a clue about the Emims. The verses read, "The Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakims, which were also accounted giants, as the Anakims. But the Moabites call them Emims." The Hebrew word for giants here is Rephaim, so we can see the Emims and the Anakims and the Rephaim all kind of under this umbrella of giants, a great people in times past who were tall. Deuteronomy 2 verse 20 reads, "That also was accounted a land of giants. Giants dwelt therein in old time, and the Ammonites called them Zamzumims." One thing that's interesting is the Hebrew root word for Zamzumim is Zamam, which means an evil plot. The name that the Ammonites called this tribe of giants reflects that they had a reputation of being evil. Joshua 15:8 reads, "And the border went up by the valley of the son of Hinnom unto the south side of the Jebusite, the same is Jerusalem. And the border went up to the top of the mountain that lieth before the valley of Hinnom westward, which is at the end of the valley of giants northward." This place, Valley of Giants, is referred to multiple times in the Old Testament. Again, the Hebrew word here for giant is Rapha, or Rephaim. We have an interesting story here in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 4 through 8. The verses read, "And it came to pass after this that there arose war at Gezer with the Philistines, at which time Sibbecai the Hushathite slew Sippai, that was of the children of the giant, and they were subdued. And there was war again with the Philistines, and Elhanan the son of Jair slew Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, whose spear staff was like a weaver's beam. And yet again there was war at Gath, where was a man of great stature, whose fingers and toes were 24, 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot, and he also was the son of the giant. Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, slew him. These were born unto the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David, and by the hand of his servants." Now we've all heard of David and Goliath, but have we heard of Sibbecai and Sippai, or Elhanan and Lami? Apparently David and his band were slaying giants left and right, as if they were everywhere, and had some kind of tie or allegiance to the Philistines. Isaiah 17:5 reads, "And it shall be when the harvestman gathereth the corn, and reapeth the ears with his arm, and it shall be as he that gathereth ears in the valley of Rephaim." Again, another reference to the Valley of Giants, or Valley of Rephaim. Another interesting point about giants is that scholars have studied the people who Joshua was commanded to wipe out, and they have found that many of these peoples had ties to giants, which was actually alluded to in some of the verses that I just read. These scholars then conclude that the Canaanite conquest was a form of God's judgment on these giants. An interesting verse is Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. It reads, "But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full." This was during God's covenant to Abraham. It was a condition that needed to be met before things proceeded. To me, this shows that God does give mercy before he executes judgment. And part of the covenant to Abraham was the land of Israel, and part of the judgment was the eradication of the Canaanite tribes, some of who are listed later in the covenant, and actually verse 20 specifically names the Rephaims. So we have examined some themes in the Bible under the umbrella of sons of God and giants, and hopefully you can see what I mean by these themes flow much more consistently if the sons of God are interpreted as fallen angels and the giants are interpreted as the offspring of these fallen angels and human females. And that if this weren't the case, these verses would make a lot less sense and would need some kind of alternate explanation by the other views that we talked about earlier. The last interesting thing I would like to talk about in this episode is that there are lines of evidence outside of the Bible that affirm the fallen angel view. First, there are all kinds of myths from ancient cultures about gods and descendants of gods and mighty men and battles that could be parallel to the fallen angel view. Also, many leaders from the early church held the fallen angel view, and disciples of the apostles held this view, which means that it is possible for it to be true. Here are some quotes from some early Christian leaders. This first one is from Justin Martyr. "The angels transgressed this appointment, and were captivated by love of women, and begot children who are those that are called demons." End quote. The second quote is from Bardasian. Quote, "If the angels likewise had not been possessed of personal freedom, they would not have consorted with daughters of men and sinned, and fallen from their places." End quote. You can notice how these quotes sound similar to the verse in 2 Peter. We can go even further back into Jewish culture before the arrival of Christ and find the fallen angel view, specifically in the book of Enoch and Jubilees. There's a lot of interest around the book of Enoch, but the traditional view of this book and also the book of Jubilees is that They are ancient Jewish writings of uncertain origin that are not canon. These books have never been wholly accepted into the canon of the Old Testament. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church actually accepts these books. However, they are an outlier in Christian tradition. So, while it is possible that these books could say true things, it is not guaranteed that everything they say is true, which is unlike the books traditionally accepted in our current Bible. In fact, verse 9 in Jude is actually a quote from the book of Enoch. However, again, just because this book observes one true thing does not mean everything in this book is true. Likewise, Paul quoted pagan poets. However, just because these pagan poets were capable of observing something true does not mean that all of their beliefs were true. I will read some quotes from the book of Jubilees and Enoch so we can get an idea of what they say about the sons of God and giants. Jubilees 3:1 reads, "The angels of God saw them on a certain year of this Jubilee, that they were beautiful to look upon, and they took themselves wives of all whom they chose, and they bare unto them sons, and they were giants." Pretty much the only difference here between the verses in Genesis and this quote here is that in Genesis it says sons of God, and the book of Jubilees says angels of God. In the book of Enoch, chapters 6, 7, and 8 talk about this phenomenon. Here are some quotes from those chapters. "And all the others, angels, together with them took themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments, in the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all acquisitions of men." Here's a quote from chapter 8. "And Azazel is the name of an angel, taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth, and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. Simjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, Armeros, the resolving of enchantments, Barakajel taught astrology, Kokabel, the constellations, Ezekiel, the knowledge of the clouds, Erekil, the signs of the earth, Shamsiel, the signs of the sun, and Sariel, the course of the moon. And as men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven." In these quotes from the book of Enoch, we see the themes of angels coming to human females and having children, and great corruption and wickedness coming from interactions with these fallen angels. You can see the parallels of these books to what the Bible says. Obviously, the book of Enoch gives a lot of details that aren't in the Bible. However, they could be consistent with biblical themes, which we'll discuss in a later episode. Another thing I'd like to mention is that a lot of people will say we can't really know for sure what these verses mean because of how mysterious they are. Now, does that mean that truth is relative and that there can be no absolute claims about what the Bible says? I would say no, and that absolute truth does exist. Just because we don't know what the truth is doesn't mean it's not there. The original audience of these writings would have known exactly what the author was trying to convey. Unfortunately, over time, there has been a loss of knowledge, and today we are in more of a state of mystery. But to me, this is more of a testament of human limitation, as opposed to a shortcoming in the Bible. To me, it makes more sense to believe that humans have limited knowledge and strive over time to try to understand the absolute truths of the Bible, as opposed to humans having the authority to determine what the Bible does or doesn't say. So that brings us to the end. There's a lot of thought out there and a lot of research and study that probably does a lot better job and goes more in depth than what I could with this episode. However, hopefully this was a sufficient introduction and explanation to the conversation around these topics. They are interesting to learn about and think about for sure. That wraps things up, and we'll see you next time.